People think pastors are safe, holy people, that if you're close to God, you're far from fear. But if that's true, then someone needs to explain why the walls of my church bleed at night, why the altar groans when I walk by, and why the grave behind the choir loft tries to speak when no one else is listening. I'm a pastor at a church deep in the woods of rural Alabama, and if I told you everything I've seen, you wouldn't sleep for a week. But if you want to know the truth, the reason why I still lock the front pew with chains, why I sleep with a crucifix under my tongue, and why I haven't let anyone ring the church bell in almost 4 years. You'll have to stay with me until the very end of this story, because the ending is the only place I can finally tell you who or what has been pretending to be God. I promise you this, by the time you hear the last words of this story, you'll understand why the congregation no longer prays out loud, why we buried our last choir director face down, and why the man who built this church burned himself alive before the dedication service could even begin. There's a reason I carry a shotgun with rock salt behind the pulpit, and no, it's not for people. My name is Pastor Elijah Mercer, and the church I tend, St. Luke's Chapel, though no one calls it that anymore, sits at the edge of a dying forest no animal dares enter. And I know it sounds impossible, maybe even ridiculous, but we follow 6 strange and terrifying rules here. Not for tradition, not for fun, not even for religion, but because we've all seen what happens when even one of them is broken. And once you see the rules, you'll understand why I don't let anyone enter through the front doors anymore. We nailed them shut 2 winters ago, after Sister May turned to ash in the center aisle. And not ash like in poetry or some old Southern metaphor. I mean ash like what's left in a fireplace after you burn through a body. I remember standing at the pulpit about to deliver the Sunday sermon, and she'd barely stepped 3 feet past the vestibule before her body seized. Her mouth opened wider than her jaw could allow, and she screamed without sound as the skin peeled off her bones like paper in a fire. And by the time the scream reached us, there was nothing left but dust and a blackened rosary. That was when we knew we had to write down the rules. The first rule is this: never open the organ case. Not even a little, not even to clean it. We used to have a sweet old man named Brother Hal who kept it tuned, swore it played sweeter than any he'd ever heard. But the last time he opened it up, something took hold of him. And when we finally forced the case open 3 days later, all we found inside were his eyes and the tips of his fingers, still twitching, pressed between the pipes as if they'd been arranged deliberately like some kind of offering. Now the organ plays by itself on nights when the fog touches the steeple, and no one has dared lift the lid since. The second rule is simple, but harder than you'd think. If you hear your own voice coming from the confessional, do not answer it. Do not speak to it. Do not acknowledge it. Walk away and do not turn around. One summer, I stayed late on a Tuesday, just sweeping up the vestibule, when I heard someone whispering my name. I stepped toward the confessional, slow, cautious, thinking maybe one of the boys had wandered in. But as I got closer, I realized the voice was mine. Not just similar, exact, same cadence, same slight rasp. And it was confessing things I'd never said out loud, not to anyone, things no one could have known. I said nothing, backed away slowly, and that night, my dog wouldn't stop growling at my reflection. The next morning, my front mirror was shattered, and all the glass had been licked clean. Rule number 3 is one you'll wish you never had to follow. If you ever see something crawl out of the baptismal tank, you must let it finish. You must not stop it. You must not touch it. You must let it leave on its own. We used to baptize people every month, but one day, something else came out. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It had no face, no eyes, and it dragged something behind it that looked like a chain made from teeth. Sister Eleanor reached out to stop it, saying, "Wait, in God's name, stop." And whatever it was turned its head, or where a head should have been, and her body collapsed inward like it had never had bones, just skin and clothes piled flat on the floor. We burned what was left of her in the church furnace. It took 11 hours. Rule number 4 is not to be questioned. Never ever ring the church bell. Not for weddings, not for funerals, not for any damn thing. The bell hasn't been rung since the incident with Jacob Kilmer, the youth pastor who thought the rules were all old superstition. He rang it 3 times. The sound shook the ground, Birds flew straight into the chapel windows and burst. The air went still. Then every member of the choir who was rehearsing that night started vomiting black water. Jacob himself was never found. But for months after, we'd find clumps of hair in the bell tower. Sometimes when it storms, the wind makes the bell move, but it never rings anymore. Not since we poured cement down its clapper shaft. Rule number 5 is one I still don't fully understand, but I know it works. Do not allow anyone to sit in the 7th pew. If they insist, ask them to leave the church. If they refuse, you must leave instead. That pew is always colder than the rest. It's warped in strange places, and more than once we've seen things watching from it. Not people, not shadows, but shapes that twitch too fast and breathe without sound. Once, a man visiting from Ohio sat there during a wedding. He smiled, said, "Feels just right." By the time the couple said their vows, he was gone. Not walked out, not slipped away, just gone. His clothes were still there, neatly folded on the pew, but the rest of him, never seen again. The bride screamed so hard her lungs collapsed. The groom hasn't spoken since. And finally, Rule 6, the one I whisper to myself before I open the chapel doors each morning. Never let a child into the pulpit room, ever. No matter what they say, no matter who they look like. The pulpit room is small, lined with old hymnals and a chair that belonged to the church's first preacher, the one who, as I said, burned himself alive before he could bless the building. We think something stayed behind. It likes the voices of children. It mimics them. One night, a little girl we didn't recognize came in during evening prayers, said she was lost, cried for her mama. We took her in, fed her, gave her warm blankets. She asked to see where I preached. I said no. She cried harder, said please, said her daddy used to stand there. I still said no. When I woke up the next morning, the back door was open, the blankets were shredded like paper, and the walls were covered in tiny handprints. Handprints that burned when we tried to wash them off. That's the 6th rule. But like I told you, there's a 7th one we never wrote down, one I can't share yet, not until you hear everything else. You wouldn't believe it now. You might laugh, or worse, you might try to test it. But if you stay with me, and I mean all the way through, I'll tell you what it is. I'll tell you what's in the tank, and I'll tell you who or what stands at the altar each night pretending to be me. Stay with me, because once you break the rules, you don't just risk death, you risk being replaced. And not even God can save you from that. It was just before dawn when I first felt the change. A thick, awful stillness that wrapped itself around the church like wet wool, not wind, not storm, but something heavier. Like the entire forest had stopped breathing at once. And as I stood at the altar with my fingers gripping the wood so tightly that splinters pushed under my skin, I knew something was wrong before I even heard the footsteps. Slow, dragging, deliberate, coming up the side path from the cemetery. And though I could see nothing through the high stained glass windows, I could feel whatever it was pressing against the edges of the chapel walls, like a mold that no longer fit its container, stretching its limbs through the air, testing where the faith ended and the rot began. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I didn't even pray. I just listened as the sound came closer. Gravel shifting, then dirt scraping, then nothing. Nothing at all for 3 whole minutes, until the door handle rattled softly 3 times, each turn a little more insistent than the last, and then silence so deep it crushed my lungs. I whispered to myself, "It's too early for anyone to be here." But even as the words left my mouth, I regretted them, because the moment I acknowledged the time, the chapel groaned beneath my feet like something ancient had heard me speak. And I knew that the thing outside the door wasn't just waiting to be let in. It was listening, testing whether I remembered the rules, testing if I'd speak again, testing if I'd crack. The handle rattled once more, then slowly slid back into place with a quiet metallic sigh that sounded too human to be just rust. I stepped back from the altar, knees trembling, and whispered, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." Not because I thought it would help, not anymore, but because it was the only string of words left in my mouth that didn't taste like fear. At sunrise, the door remained unopened, but muddy handprints lined the entire frame, too large to be human, too low to be standing, and each one pressed in so deeply the paint had bubbled and peeled like the wood itself had tried to resist the touch. I didn't clean it. I never clean marks like that. They're warnings, memorials, proof that I wasn't hallucinating, that whatever walks the grounds at night knows the shape of the chapel better than any living soul. It was later that same day when Brother Curtis returned, and I swear to you on everything sacred, I buried that man 6 months ago, after we found what was left of his body curled inside the 7th pew, spine broken backward, mouth wide open as if frozen in a silent scream. His Bible still clutched to his chest like it could protect him even after death. But there he stood, right outside my office window at noon, smiling, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers like he always did on his way to visit the sick. And my first thought wasn't joy, wasn't relief, wasn't even confusion. It was dread so sharp and so cold that my legs went numb beneath me, and I had to grip the edge of my desk just to stay standing. I didn't open the door. I didn't speak. I just watched as he stared back at me, not blinking, not moving, just waiting. And when I squinted closer, heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird, I realized that the wildflowers weren't wildflowers at all. They were finger bones, white and clean, tied together with a strip of what looked like communion cloth. And Curtis was holding them as gently as a man holds a gift for his wife. That's when I noticed his collarbone was fractured. Not fresh, but hanging askew like it had never healed properly. And the smell that came through the gap in the window frame wasn't sweat or grass or cologne, but rot, deep and wet, and filled with the stench of something buried too shallow and pulled out too soon. He never knocked, never moved. Just stood there smiling with those pale, blistered lips, and when I finally closed my eyes and whispered, "You're dead, Curtis. Go back to the ground," I heard him say, in a voice so dry it crackled. "I only died once, but you've got more in you than that, preacher." I waited until sunset before I stepped out. The bouquet was gone. So was the man. But in its place, on the stone path leading to the chapel doors, was a perfect circle of salt, broken in only one place, right at the entrance, as if someone had stepped through it backwards. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights on. I kept the Bible open. And still, the whispers came through the walls. Not from the wind, not from the woods, but from the organ case, that ancient coffin of pipes that hadn't been touched in years. I heard music, slow and low, like the first chords of a funeral march, rising up with a tremble that made the floorboards hum beneath my feet. I wanted to run. I wanted to shout. But I knew if I broke the first rule, if I so much as touched that latch, I wouldn't make it to morning. And then I heard my name. Once. From inside the confessional. "Elijah," it whispered, perfectly matching my voice, not just the tone, but the little stutter I sometimes get when I'm scared, the one I've hidden from my sermons for years. The voice came again, closer this time, almost amused. "Elijah, you remember what you did, don't you? You know what's buried under the pulpit. You know what screams when you sleep." I didn't move, didn't answer, didn't even breathe too loud. I backed away slowly, turned the corner of the chapel without looking behind me, and forced my feet to keep walking, even as I heard my own voice laugh from behind the wooden screen, like it had just told the best joke in the world. That was the same night the baptismal tank overflowed, not with water, but with something thick and dark and filled with hair. I didn't touch it. I didn't clean it. I watched from the hallway as the surface trembled, then split, and something wet and pale crawled out, dragging a long chain of teeth behind it like a leash. It didn't look at me, didn't speak, just slithered toward the front doors, twitching and pulsing like it was breathing through its skin. And I knew, that if I stopped it, if I so much as stepped into its path, I wouldn't be writing this now. It disappeared into the woods without a sound. I locked the door behind it and knelt in the aisle until sunrise, whispering the 6th rule over and over again like a prayer. But the worst part, the part I can't stop thinking about, is what happened the next morning. Because sitting in the 7th pew, right where we found Curtis's broken body all those months ago, was a girl I'd never seen before, maybe 8 years old, pale, barefoot, wearing a dress that looked 50 years out of time, smiling like she knew every secret I'd tried to bury. And when I approached her slowly, heart shivering in my chest, she tilted her head and asked in the smallest voice, "Can I see the pulpit room, Pastor? My daddy used to stand there." My mouth dried up, my skin went cold, because the last man to ever stand in the pulpit room was the first preacher of this chapel. And he never had a daughter. He burned before she could ever be born. The moment I saw the girl sitting in the 7th pew, smiling like she had some secret only the church could hold, I knew something far worse than death itself was about to unfold. Her eyes, pale as moonlight, blinked slowly, deliberately, as if they were seeing me for the first time, and her lips parted just enough to reveal a row of teeth too sharp, too white, like they'd been filed down to perfect points. I couldn't breathe. The air in the church thickened, each second stretching longer than the last, and I could feel the weight of the room pressing down on me, suffocating me, as I stood frozen at the edge of the aisle, staring at this impossible vision. It wasn't just her presence. It was the stillness of the air, the unnatural quiet that had fallen over everything. Even the wind outside seemed to have died, leaving only the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. I had to move, had to do something, but my legs wouldn't cooperate, and my mind was racing, searching for a rule, any rule, that might explain this. I knew I had to follow Rule 5. I couldn't let anyone stay in the 7th pew, but my feet stayed glued to the ground as the girl's gaze never left me, her smile stretching wider with every second that passed. And then, as if she had heard my thoughts, she whispered in a voice so sweet and wrong that it made my blood freeze. "Do you remember the first time you came here, Pastor Elijah? You stood in the pulpit, just like I'm supposed to." Her words sent a shiver straight to my bones, because I did remember, though I couldn't understand how she could possibly know. I wasn't the first to stand there, and no child should have known that. I wasn't supposed to remember anything like that. "You're not supposed to be here," I whispered, almost choking on the words, trying to steady my trembling hands to force my mind to focus. But it was like she was pulling me into her gaze, and everything around us seemed to blur, as if the world was melting away and leaving only her, sitting there, too calm, too still, and that smile that felt like it was erasing everything I had ever known. "I have to go," I said, my voice barely audible, but when I took a step back, she raised her hand, fingers curling into the air in a motion that was both delicate and commanding. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't just the pew. It wasn't just a place in the church. The 7th pew was an invitation, a gateway, a trap, and if I didn't get her out of it, I would be next. "I won't leave, Pastor Elijah." The words were like ice pouring down my spine, and the moment she spoke, I felt the weight of the church pressing down harder. The lights flickered once, then twice, and then I heard it. The faintest sound, like the low hum of the bell ringing, but the bell wasn't moving. It couldn't be. Rule 4 was absolute. Never ring the bell. Not for weddings, not for funerals, not for anything. The bell had to stay silent. But as the air thickened and the walls began to tremble under the pressure of something unseen, I knew the bell wasn't the only thing about to break. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and then, in a whisper almost lost in the chaos of my racing thoughts, I heard something else, a sound that made my heart nearly stop in my chest. A child's laughter. Soft, playful, like the sound of a child skipping through a field of wildflowers. But the tone was wrong, too deep, too sharp, and as I turned to look toward the back of the church, I saw it. The pulpit room door was open, and standing there, illuminated by the dim light, was a figure I didn't recognize. A child. Or what had been a child. It stood in the doorway, looking out at me with eyes blacker than pitch, smiling, its hands outstretched, fingers twisting unnaturally. I could hear its breath, shallow and raspy, and even though every bone in my body screamed at me to run, I couldn't. The girl in the 7th pew wasn't laughing anymore. She was watching me, and with every passing second, I felt myself being pulled toward the pulpit room, toward the thing standing in the doorway. "Don't go," the girl whispered from behind me, her voice a low hum, a command more than a plea. And yet I found my body moving, slow, deliberate, my feet carrying me forward despite the sickening dread that filled my chest. Rule 6. Never let a child into the pulpit room. No matter what they say, no matter who they look like. But it wasn't just a child. It couldn't be. It was something worse, something that had crawled from the ground, something that had learned how to take form, how to mimic, how to twist the rules to its own advantage. I didn't stop walking. I couldn't. I reached the door, and the thing in the doorway smiled wider, its mouth cracking like old wood breaking under pressure, its skin stretching in ways that should have been impossible, But its eyes, those dark, empty eyes, held me captive, dragging me closer, one slow step at a time. And then, just as I crossed the threshold, I heard it. The organ case. It was open. I had broken Rule 1. I hadn't touched it, hadn't even gotten near it, but the sound, the music, it was different now, alive. The same funeral march, but now louder, faster, its chords vibrating through the walls, slamming into my skull. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. Every part of my body wanted to scream, to run, but I stood there, frozen in the pulpit room, staring at the thing before me that wasn't just a child, but something much older, much darker. And when it spoke again, its voice wasn't the sweet, innocent sound it had been before. "You're mine now," it said, and its voice reverberated through the room, shaking the walls. And once the bell rings, there's no going back. Suddenly, the ground beneath me cracked. The pulpit room began to split, the air thickening with the smell of sulfur, and I realized, too late, that I had walked straight into the trap. The rules weren't meant to protect me. They were meant to hold me here, to keep me locked in this place where nothing would ever leave. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut, the walls began to close in around me, and all I could hear was the sound of the bell, faint at first, then louder, the ringing getting closer, louder, until it felt like it was inside my head, inside my chest, a sound that would swallow me whole, and then everything went dark. The ringing of the bell seemed to shatter the darkness, a deafening toll that vibrated in my skull, rattling every bone in my body, sending waves of fear crashing through me like a violent storm. I didn't know how long I had been in the pulpit room after everything went dark. Seconds, minutes, hours. Time had ceased to exist in that place, consumed by the unrelenting toll of the bell and the suffocating silence that followed. The smell of sulfur, thick and cloying, filled my nostrils, making it hard to breathe as the darkness seemed to pulse, moving closer and closer, tightening around me like a vice. The air had become too thick, like it was pressing in from all sides, suffocating me, until I felt my chest tighten with the weight of it. I was trapped. No way out. No way to escape. The door was gone. The walls had closed in. In that endless, choking blackness, I heard a voice. Low. Soft. It barely reached me, but I recognized it. It was the voice of the girl who had sat in the 7th pew, the one who had never left. Her voice was soft, almost comforting, but there was something wrong with it. It didn't belong in that place. It didn't belong in my head. "You thought you could stop it," she whispered, and I could feel her words like fingers creeping along my spine, tightening their grip until I could hardly move. "You thought you could ignore the rules. You thought the church was your sanctuary, your safe place. But now you're ours." The walls seemed to hum with her words, the air pulsing as if it too was alive with some dark energy, something that had been awakened, something that had been lying in wait. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to escape, but my feet wouldn't move. My mouth was dry and no sound would escape me. I was paralyzed, locked in place, my mind spinning as the bell continued to toll, ringing louder, ringing longer. It wouldn't stop. It couldn't stop. And then just when I thought my mind would break under the pressure, I saw it. The door. It was there. Just beyond the darkness, I could see the pulpit room door, standing open. I couldn't tell if it had always been there, if it had just appeared, but I knew it was my only chance. I had to reach it. I had to get out. The bell rang again, louder this time, and the floor beneath me seemed to tremble as if the very earth itself was shaking in response to the toll. The door was the only thing real, the only thing that could save me. I moved toward it, every step feeling like a battle, like the very ground beneath my feet was trying to drag me back into the darkness. I could hear it now, the sound of something crawling, dragging itself across the floor behind me, the slow, scraping sound of something that shouldn't be. It was getting closer. I could feel the cold breath on my neck, the air growing heavier with each passing second. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. "Don't go through that door, Pastor Elijah." The voice again. It was closer this time, and I could feel its presence behind me, an oppressive weight that pressed against my shoulders, that pushed me toward the door as if it were trying to force me to stay in this room, in this nightmare. But I had no choice. I had to escape. I had to get out. The bell rang again, this time with such force that it felt like it was ripping the air apart. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I grabbed the handle, It was cold, so cold it burned my skin. But I didn't care. I wrenched the door open and stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, desperate for anything that wasn't the suffocating darkness of the pulpit room. I slammed the door shut behind me, but the tolling of the bell continued, echoing through the walls, through the very foundation of the church. It was as if the church itself was alive, and it wasn't going to let me go. The hallway before me was long and narrow, stretching out like some endless corridor that led nowhere. But at the far end, I could see light, the faintest glimmer of it, like a candle burning in the distance. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I ran toward the light, my footsteps pounding against the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart slamming against my ribcage. As I ran, I could feel the air shift around me, like something was moving, something was following. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. The light ahead was my only hope. I had to reach it. I had to escape. But the moment I reached the light, I knew something was wrong. The hallway had twisted. The walls had shifted. The door at the end of the hall wasn't the same. It wasn't the door I had seen before. It was wrong. It was alive. The light flickered, casting shadows that twisted and stretched like fingers reaching toward me, like they were trying to pull me into the darkness. And I could hear it again, the sound of the bell, louder than ever, but now it was joined by another sound, a voice, a deep, guttural voice that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't escape, Pastor Elijah." It echoed in the hall, in my head, in my very soul, and I froze, paralyzed by the realization that I was still trapped, that I had never left the church. No matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I fought, I was never going to escape. I was never going to leave. The door ahead of me opened, and I saw it. The thing, it wasn't a child anymore. It wasn't even human. It was something worse, something darker, something that had no shape, no form, just a mass of shadows and teeth and eyes. And it was coming for me. "You should have followed the rules," it whispered, its voice 1,000 voices all speaking at once. And I realized with sickening clarity that it had always been here. It had always been watching, waiting, and now it was going to take me. And in that moment, I knew. The bell wasn't just a sound. It was a call that no one could ignore, a call that had pulled me deeper and deeper into the darkness, into a place where there was no escape. And as the thing reached for me, its twisted hands outstretched, I understood one terrifying truth. The church had never been my sanctuary. It had been my grave. The thing's twisted hands reached toward me, its fingers curling like claws, dark tendrils of shadow lashing out, grasping, pulling, dragging me into its suffocating, otherworldly embrace. And I could feel it then, that horrific pull, like gravity itself had shifted, and I was being pulled into some dark abyss that I had never known. A place where nothing was real except the terror that gripped every inch of my body, every beat of my heart. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat, choked off by the darkness that seemed to close around me tighter with each passing second. And I realized with a horrible, creeping clarity that it wasn't just the church that had changed. It was me. I was being twisted, molded into something else, something that could never escape. The bell tolled again, louder this time, almost shaking the walls themselves, and with its toll came an oppressive weight, a suffocating pressure that pinned me in place, that stole the last bit of hope from my chest. "You can't run," the voice from the thing echoed, but it wasn't just one voice now. It was the voices of 1,000 souls, each one more distorted than the last, each one speaking in harmony to drown me in its terror. "You can't hide. This is where you belong, Pastor Elijah. You were never meant to leave. You were never meant to be free." The darkness seemed to pulse with those words, every inch of the air vibrating with the promise of eternal torment. I tried to pull away, to fight, but my feet were frozen, my legs stiff, as if the very ground had claimed me, had bound me to this nightmare. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Every second felt like a century. The thing's voice grew louder, more frantic, like it was getting closer, its claws scratching against the very fabric of my soul. "We warned you, Pastor." The voice rang out, louder and clearer now, unmistakable. It was the voice of the child who had sat in the 7th pew, the one I had tried to ignore. "We warned you not to break the rules. Now you'll never leave. Not ever. Not again." My body jerked as I was yanked forward, pulled toward the shadowy form that loomed before me. the darkness swirling and churning around it like a storm, like the very heart of some infernal chaos. I could feel the heat of it now, the heat of something that should not exist, something ancient, something malevolent. The air was thick with it, as if it were a living thing, pressing against my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I tried to scream again, but no sound came, just a choking, rasping breath as I gasped for air. And then, in a flash of horrifying clarity, I remembered the sixth rule. I had broken it. I had broken them all. But most importantly, I had broken that rule. The pulpit room was sacred, a place that no child should ever enter, a place where the living and the dead were never meant to meet. But I had let it happen. I had let it in. And now, there was no going back. The thing that had once been a child, that had once smiled at me with innocent eyes, was no longer the thing I had thought it was. Its eyes had turned black, empty, like pits that stretched on forever, and its mouth was twisted in a grotesque grin, full of sharp teeth, jagged and gnarled. I could feel the darkness in those eyes, the weight of it pressing against me, suffocating me, drowning me in its despair. It was never just a child. It had never been anything human. It was a thing born of darkness, born of the very evil that lingered in the church, that had always been there, waiting for someone like me to stumble across it. "You broke the rules," the voice hissed. Now a chorus of a thousand souls that had been waiting, that had been trapped here for eternity, bound by the rules that I had ignored, and now they were all coming for me. "Now you will pay the price." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was fall deeper into the blackness, deeper into the abyss that I had unwittingly unleashed. The thing's hands reached out again, and this time, I couldn't pull away. They grabbed me, claws sinking into my flesh, and I could feel the cold of them, the unnatural, freezing cold that seeped into my skin, into my bones, until I was numb. My limbs were heavy, my chest tight. I could feel it dragging me downward into the depths of something that should never have existed. I had broken the rules. I had broken all of them. And now there would be no escape. As the darkness closed in, I realized there was no room for repentance, no room for salvation. The bell tolled once more, louder than ever, and in that sound, I felt the weight of the rules that had been broken, the weight of the price that had to be paid. I had ignored them all. I had defied them all. And now, the price was being exacted, a price that no one could escape, a price that would drag me into the same eternal nightmare that had claimed so many before me. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur, the scent of something ancient and unholy, and I could hear the thing's laughter, distorted and jagged, filling the air like a final, mournful symphony. And in that last final moment, as the darkness closed around me and I was pulled into its waiting grasp, I knew that the church would never be the same again. It would never be a place of sanctuary. It would never be a place of light. It would always be a place of shadows, a place of rules that could never be broken, a place where the darkness would always linger, waiting for the next fool who dared to ignore them. And as the bell tolled one final time, I felt the last shred of my soul slip away, swallowed whole by the church, swallowed whole by the darkness. Forever.